Bread is simple. At its most basic, just combine flour, water, yeast, and salt. Gluten-free bread is anything but. Most recipes call for at least half a dozen flours in an attempt to recreate something that it's not and just can't be, I'm sorry to say. I stumbled upon this super simple gluten-free bread recipe on Serious Eats a number of years back. I was drawn to it because it basically used one type of flour, brown rice flour, and it worked. When something is that simple, you just get a clearer expression of its primary ingredient. So what happens if I want to substitute brown rice flour for something else? What would happen if I made my own rice flour? So my pantry right now is loaded up with an ample supply of basmati rice, and I thought I would try something new. I know I can pulverize just about anything with a strong enough blender, and my Vitamix is exactly that. I load up the cup of my blender with 500 grams of basmati rice and blend it on max speed until it becomes a fine powder. No, it's not as fine as the stuff you get out of the bag with a stone mill, but I think this will do just fine. I confess, this recipe is a little bit more complicated than a 4-ingredient bread recipe, but it is a cakewalk compared to most gluten-free bread recipes out there. Into my KitchenAid stand mixer, I add my dry ingredients. The 500 grams of basmati flour, 150 grams of tapioca starch, 18 grams of xanthan gum, 12 grams of salt, and 2 packets of instant yeast. After a quick mix, I add the wet ingredients. I start with 4 tablespoons of coconut oil. Then I add 4 eggs, one by one. And it's good practice, by the way, to avoid breaking the eggs directly into the mixing bowl so no stray bits of shell get mixed in by accident. Once the eggs are incorporated, I start adding 3.5 cups of warm water by the ladleful, adding a little bit more, bit by bit, until it's incorporated. This is not boiling water, mind you. Boiling water will both kill the yeast and scramble the eggs and leave you with an inedible mess. This water is somewhere between 95 to 100 degrees and just warm enough to help nudge the yeast in the right direction a little faster. This yields a thick, sticky batter that goes right into the greased bread tin. I'm using a Pullman tin, which should make a perfectly rectangular sandwich loaf by containing the bread's rise underneath its lid. I've made this bread a lot and have always had success without the lid, but with all the yeast it comes out looking a little bit wonky. The next step is just to let it proof for its initial rise. I give it 1 hour in a warm place and preheat the oven to 350 degrees. With an hour elapsed, you can see it's now about 3/4 of the way up the tin. Time to go into the oven. So about 20 minutes in, I'm busy cooking my yellow dal recipe without a care in the world, before I realize I've made a grave mistake. That sound was the yeast pushing so hard on the top of the tin that it knocked the entire thing over onto its side and popped the top off. I wish I had the wherewithal to grab my camera in this moment and get a shot of it, but my instinct was just to save the bread. It was actually kind of a miracle that the batter didn't explode all over the oven. The lid was on there long enough though that it helped crisp the top of the loaf and formed a seal that kept everything in its place, more or less. Clearly, this bread wants to be free, so I left it in to finish baking without a lid, wonky looking or not. After an eventful hour in the oven, it was time to come out. I popped this out of the tin and onto a cooling rack for about 30 minutes. Now, whenever this bread comes out of the oven to cool, it is the longest 30 minutes you ever experience. Seriously, you always sort of expect freshly baked bread to be fragrant, but I was doubly expecting it with basmati flour. Surprisingly though, the bread wasn't fragrant like basmati is when you cook a pot of rice. Instead of that floral quality of the rice, this aroma was of a buttery bread. Considering this is butter and dairy free, that is a feat. It's also completely intoxicating. I think grinding the rice grains fresh really contributes to that amazing aroma. As soon as it's time, and not a second later, I slice into this puppy. Yes, it looks a little bit lopsided. Yes, I should have let it bake for another 5 minutes. But yes, it's everything that aroma promised. It's got a nice crispy exterior and a tender crumb inside. Is it dense? Sure, a little bit. That kind of comes with the territory of gluten-free bread. but it still scratches that itch that comes with eating fresh bread with just about any meal. A little mustard oil on a plate with salt and pepper is a nice homage to the bread and olive oil I grew up with. Mustard oil and basmati are stellar together, so it's no surprise how well it works. I also love to sop up a bowl of dal with bread. I made these two recipes on the same day for a reason. Basmati bread is a lesson that the ingredients just need to speak for themselves sometimes. I've mixed enough flour blends over the years trying to replicate AP flour, and the results are always, they're fine. Most of the time though, it's a parlor trick. There's value in that sometimes, I can't argue that, but I'm hunting for exceptional food. Making gluten-free bread and being required to clear that bar has long felt impossible. I'll tell you what, this is a giant step in the right direction. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to see you next time. Bye now.